In the closing months of World War II, as the mighty German war machine collapsed and its soldiers surrendered in the tens of thousands, a strange and haunting contrast emerged. On one side of Europe, German prisoners of war, men who had once fought fiercely against the Allies, were given food, shelter, and in many cases, dignity by American captors. On the other side, deep within the Soviet Union's reach, those same German soldiers were thrust into a nightmare of starvation, labor camps, and a lingering death that seemed to echo the suffering they themselves had inflicted. But why? Why were German prisoners treated so differently by two nations who had been allies in the very same war? Imagine being a young German soldier in 1945, stripped of your rifle, hands raised, heart pounding. If you were captured by American troops, you might find yourself herded into a camp with barracks, given rations, and perhaps even allowed to write home. You might even discover that your guards were more curious about you than cruel, some offering cigarettes, others speaking in broken German. But if your path of surrender led eastward, into Soviet hands, your journey was very different. You could be marched for days without food, beaten by guards, forced into trains packed so tightly that men suffocated, and sent to Siberian labor camps where freezing winds and endless toil claimed countless lives. The war was the same, the prisoners were the same, but the treatment could not have been more different. To understand this paradox, we must dig deeper, not just into military history, but into psychology, ideology, and raw human memory. For the Americans, capturing German prisoners was often a matter of logistics, of following international conventions, and of demonstrating the values they claimed to fight for. For the Soviets, it was a matter of revenge, survival, and sheer rage born of unimaginable suffering. Answer: one soldier's fate depended not on his actions, but on which flag rose above him at the moment of surrender. The Americans entered the war with an image of themselves as liberators, not conquerors. They were not fighting on their own soil. American cities were not bombed to rubble. Their families had not been massacred by German invaders. Their fight was driven by duty and principle, not by vengeance. Answer: when the surrendering German soldiers fell into their hands, the Americans often adhered to the Geneva Convention, ensuring food, medical care, and humane treatment. In fact, some German POWs in American camps even remarked that they were eating better than they had in the Wehrmacht itself. They were safe, sometimes even able to work on farms, play music, or engage in classes organized by their captors. It was not paradise, but it was survival, and survival with dignity. But shift the scene eastward. The Soviet Union bore wounds so deep, so bloody, that even history struggles to measure them. Over 20 million Soviet citizens perished during the war. Entire cities, like Stalingrad and Leningrad, were reduced to ruins soaked in blood and starvation. Villages were burned to ash, children slaughtered, families torn apart. When the Red Army captured German soldiers, they were not just taking prisoners, they were seizing the very embodiment of their tormentors. To the Soviet mind, every German uniform carried the weight of mass graves, burned fields, and starving children. For them, mercy was not justice, revenge was. That difference in emotional weight shaped everything. American soldiers could look at a captured German and see a defeated enemy, a man who might be useful or at least harmless. Soviet soldiers looked at the same man and saw the killer of their mothers, the destroyer of their homes, the reason for their endless suffering. The journey of German POWs in Soviet hands was brutal from the very beginning. Prisoners were often forced to march east in death marches, with little to no food, collapsing along the way. Those who survived the march faced transport in cattle cars with no sanitation, where disease spread like wildfire. And when they finally reached their destination, often the infamous gulags of Siberia, they were forced into endless labor, cutting timber, mining, building roads, working until their bodies gave out. Many never returned. Of the millions of German soldiers captured by the Soviets, hundreds of thousands perished in captivity. It was a slow death sentence disguised as imprisonment. The train doors creaked open, and the cold air of the east slapped their faces like a warning. German prisoners stumbled out, thin, bruised, eyes darting at the endless expanse of Siberian snow. Behind them, guards barked orders, and the prisoners knew this was not captivity in the sense they had imagined. It was a descent into another kind of war, a war against hunger, frost, and exhaustion. From dawn to night, they swung pickaxes, cut timber, dug trenches in frozen earth so hard it shattered their tools. The rations, dark bread, watery soup, were never enough. One soldier later recalled that he ate grass in summer just to keep the hollow ache at bay. In those camps, death was not sudden. It was slow, measured in the shrinking of muscle, the coughing of lungs, the silence of men who stopped speaking altogether. Some tried to keep fragments of their humanity alive. A prisoner carved tiny chess pieces from wood scraps. Another sang old folk songs in a cracked voice that reminded men of home. But for many, the only constant companions were cold and hunger. And yet, there were also moments when a guard slipped an extra piece of bread, or when Russian villagers, themselves poor and scarred by war, shared a potato or a blanket. Even in the darkest places, sparks of compassion flickered, brief but unforgettable. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, German prisoners in American camps wrote letters to their families, some describing the strange miracle of being fed well, even too well. They worked on farms in the sunshine, learned English, and in some cases, sat in classrooms where American officers lectured on democracy. They were still captives, but the contrast was stark. One world shaped by vengeance and survival, the other by resources, law, and reputation. Why did the fates of these men diverge so dramatically? The answer lies not just in politics, but in memory and scars. For the Soviets, the war had been a wound carved into every household. They remembered German armies burning villages, starving cities, leaving behind mass graves. To them, mercy was betrayal. Revenge was justice. Every German in uniform symbolized the nightmare that had nearly destroyed their land. For the Americans, the war was fought far from their own towns and cities. They carried no personal memories of children starving in bombed-out basements, no visions of villages erased. They could afford the luxury of following conventions, of showing the world that they fought for principles as well as victory. And they had the resources to do it: food, shelter, and a continent untouched by the bombs that had flattened Europe. The outcome was not only measured in survival rates, but in legacies. Thousands of Germans who lived through American captivity returned home with a story of unexpected humanity, sometimes even admiration. Some would later admit that their first encounter with democracy and freedom came not from books, but from their time as POWs in America. On the other hand, those who returned from Soviet camps often carried scars for life: physical weakness, haunted eyes, and stories of frostbite, hunger, and endless labor. Many never spoke of it at all, burying the memories under silence. History, then, holds two truths at once: that the same war produced two very different prisons, and that the fate of a soldier often depended less on his choices than on geography and luck. The world saw, side by side, the best and the worst of what human beings can do to their enemies. And so we are left with a haunting question: what is justice in the aftermath of war? Is it mercy, offering food to the very men who once carried rifles against you? Or is it vengeance, forcing them to feel the hunger and pain your people endured? The Americans chose one answer, the Soviets another. Neither erased the past, neither healed the wounds fully. But decades later, as survivors grew old and the camps dissolved into memory, what remained most vividly were not the barracks or the fences, but the human choices, moments of kindness or cruelty that defined whether a man lived with dignity or died in despair. Perhaps that is the final lesson, that in the shadow of war, how we treat the defeated says as much about us as victory itself. And the story of the German prisoners is not just about two nations. It is about the fragile line between vengeance and humanity, and the heavy cost when mercy is lost.